Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Sojourner. I'm an economist at Economists Incorporated. And today we wanted to cover an introduction to bidding in an FCC-style clock auction. Our goal is to cover the basics of a clock auction that the FCC typically runs, and to give new bidders or even people who are experienced and have exposure to the FCC clock auction format some insight into what bidding looks like for actual bidders. Before I dive into anything, though, I do want to mention that Auction 107's quiet period is currently in place. I'm not going to be discussing anything related to Auction 107, and I'm not going to be, our team's not going to be taking any questions related to Auction 107. So I wanted to quickly cover why we're going over the FCC's clock auction style format. The primary motivating reasons are that the auction has been tremendously successful in the US, and its popularity is increasing around the world. Most recently, we've seen Canada for the 3,500 megahertz auction move away from the CCA to a clock auction, and that trend can continue around the world for other countries as well. Before we get into the components of this auction design, I wanted to quickly cover what makes up what are the typical building blocks of the FCC style clock auction. And the way that we're going to be doing this is looking at a piece of software that bidders would actually use to bid in an auction. This is just for a generic made up band auction. It's similar in design to what we've seen in Auction 102, where we have PEA level markets. We have upper and lower bands, which is just two separate pieces of the spectrum being bid on independently. So for example, we can see that the market in the first two rows is New York, being comprised of categories lower and upper. So one of the key things that you can see right here is that the PEA markets are comprised of generic product spaces. Okay, so unlike in an SMRA here, we're bidding for all the blocks of spectrum within a given PEA category band collectively with a single bid price. Okay, so the supply here, for example, is 6 uniformly across the entire product space. This has the advantage of increasing the speed that an auction can be conducted if the pieces of spectrum within the PEA are sufficiently substitutable. And then typically an assignment round can be used in order to allow bidders to express their preferences after the generic bidding portion of the auction has been conducted. A second thing that is important to note here when taking a look at this auction design is that comprises the FCC style clock auction is the price window. The price window also allows for increased bidding speed, and essentially every round after the initial round, bidders are faced with an opening price, which is the current posted price of the product, and a clock price, which is the maximum value up to which they can express a valuation during that round. And this has the advantage of speeding up the auction because the auctioneer, typically the regulator, the FCC, can express a larger price window and then give bidders the opportunity to express any value within that price window. So they're not limited to just jumping the increments that the auctioneer sets up. They can express any value in the price window, okay? And then the third component that is really fundamental to this FCC-style clock auction is the bid queue, which is a method of prioritizing bids submitted by bidders that the auctioneer uses in order to try to process their requests. So if you think about each bid by a bidder being a request, the auctioneer collects them all, prioritizes them ascendingly by price, and then attempts to process as many as they can subject to different rules. And we're going to walk through the different types of bids that you can submit and how to think about the economic interpretation of not only how the bids are processed by the bidder, but also the values and the information that you're expressing to the auctioneer. Okay. So the first thing that a bidder typically does is, is express an opening bid in an auction. And there's three important things to understand about an opening bid in the auction. The first is that it is the initial position from which all future bids are going to be movements away from. This is your anchor point within the auction. Every single value that you express after this will come back to being a movement away from your initial position in some aspect, okay? When constructing this initial bid, you have to consider what's called the initial eligibility of the bidder. So in our example, our representative bidder has 300,000 bidding units of eligibility. These are akin to poker chips that you would buy to enter a game, right? Each market has an associated number of bidding units, and you make an upfront payment to the auctioneer to acquire some amount of bidding units. In our example, 300,000. That's the limit for which I can express demand in this auction. So if the sum of the bidding units times the quantity I request has to be less than or equal to that initial eligibility. So if we go ahead and enter a bid for 3 blocks in all the product categories from New York to New Orleans, we can see that our request eligibility is 297,600, right? That's less than or equal to our initial eligibility. So this is a valid bid. Now, so we can go ahead and stage and validate it, and this validation algorithm will actually tell us, hey, this is perfectly acceptable. Now, we're not using all of our 300,000 eligibility points. We're using not at least 95% of it, though. So an important thing to understand when submitting this initial bid and all future bids is that your activity in this round results in your eligibility of the next round. And in our example auction here, if you use 95% of your current eligibility, you maintain it. So we can go ahead and import results and take a look at what happens with this initial bid and talk about what information we gain from importing results and what, how to interpret this information. So there's two primary things we're told by the auctioneer. The first is the aggregate demand that we can see in column AB. This tells us the total demand for products within a given market category combination. So for example, in New York Upper, we see 12 units of total demand. We know that 3 of them are ours, so the rest of the market comprises 9 units of demand, okay? The second piece of information that we find out is the clock price. So now we can see the price window. The posted price is the opening price of round 2, and the clock price is the maximum price for which we can express a value during this round. So for example, in New York, it's $87,560. Okay. These are the two big pieces of information that the auctioneer tells us. And it's important to take a look at these because the excess demand in the market is what determines if a posted price rises to the clock price during a round of bidding. So if we look at Orlando, Florida Upper, for example, there's a single unit of excess demand. If that remains after bidding for round 2 completes, we expect the posted price to rise to the clock price. For New Orleans Lower, there are 0 units of excess demand. And if it remains that way, we expect the posted price to stay the same and for the clock price to stay the same. So there is no excess demand driving the clock price upwards, okay? So it's important to understand these expectations for how your financial exposure will develop during the course of the auction, given the 2 pieces of information that the auctioneer tells you. Okay, so after taking a look at the round 1 bid results, we want to discuss what happens with the hold bid, with a hold position bid. We see questions a lot from bidders about what hold position bids mean and how to interpret the exposure that comes with hold position bids. So a hold position bid is just a request to maintain current demand at the clock price. You don't face any constraints from the auctioneer, so you have an expectation that this bid will be processed. So the question is, what information are you telling the auctioneer and what valuations are you expressing to them? And for hold bids, it's that you're willing to maintain this position up to the clock price. And this is the part that can be a little confusing. But if you take a look at the requested commitment, it assumes the clock price for all of your bids because you are actually indicating to the auctioneer that you are willing to pay up to the clock price. So, for example, in New Orleans lower, where there's zero excess demand, you might say to yourself, there's nothing driving the posted price up to the clock price. So why am I indicating that I'm willing to take up to the clock price? Am I bidding against myself? Why is the clock price used to calculate my requested commitment? And the economic interpretation of this is fairly straightforward. The information that you've told the auctioneer is that you want to maintain your current position. If there was some price within the posted price clock price window from which you did not want to maintain that position, then you would need to tell the auctioneer not only that price, but what quantity you would like to fall to if the price rises to that price as you move along the supply curve, right? So what you're telling the auctioneer here is very simply, I want to maintain my position. You've given them no further information, so the economic interpretation is clear. You're bidding up to the clock price. So our expectation here is that New Orleans lower may not rise, but that's not a given. Demand can enter into that market. And for example, Orlando, Florida upper, we expect that to rise, the posted price to the clock price, but that's also not a given. Demand can move away from that market. So we can go ahead and import results and take a look at what happens. Okay, so we've imported results from our hold position bid. And what we can see is that while we were fully processed in all markets, the New Orleans lower market had demand enter it. So even though our expectation was that the posted price may not rise, it did, and that's perfectly in line with the auction rules, and the posted price rose to the clock price. So our financial exposure has increased there, even though that may not have been your best guess before the round started. It's just very important to understand what values you're expressing to the auctioneer and how that influences your maximum financial exposure. Conversely, Orlando, Florida, which had Orlando, Florida lower, or upper, which had excess demand, did not, the posted price did not rise to the clock price because a unit of demand left, and that unit of demand left with the bidder bidding it at the previous posted price. So the clock price did not rise because excess demand left the market. So while we submitted a hold bid, our financial exposure actually changed in a way that may not have been our best guess at the start of the round. So it's just very important to understand what valuations you're expressing giving a hold bid. It's also interesting to note that the hold bid at one point was the default bid submitted for you if you didn't express anything to the auctioneer. That changed, I believe, with Auction 102, where a drop bid for all products became the default. But it is important to understand what default bids there are given the auctioneer's rules and what values those express to the auctioneer. So now that we've covered the hold bid and we've covered that even though a market may not have excess demand, that does not mean that the price clock can no longer rise within the auction, I wanted to go through the economic interpretation of the drop bid. And this is where we get into a topic called intra-round bidding and the values expressed given that. So drop bids are requests to reduce your position from your currently processed position at a given price. These bids are subject to what is called the no excess supply rule, meaning that you can request a drop of any quantity and the auctioneer will attempt to process this request of yours until supply falls to, or demand falls to supply. And if demand never exceeded supply, then none of your requests will be processed. But it's still perfectly valid to request those drops because demand may enter the market, provide excess demand, and then the auctioneer can go back and process your requested drop. Okay, so in this round, we're gonna drop one block in the New York lower at a price point of 0.5. And I wanna quickly discuss what the price point is and what information it's telling the auctioneer. It's got a very straightforward and intuitive economic interpretation. Currently, at the posted price, I desire 3 blocks of demand. If the posted price rose to the clock price, I would only want 2. And so I can indicate to the auctioneer where in that window I transition from wanting 3 to 2. And if the posted price does not rise all the way to the clock price, I may maintain my 3 block position, or I may fall to the 2 block position if it rises above. So currently I've said if the price point is 0.5, I want 3 blocks up until the bid price of $91,938, which is halfway between the posted and clock price. If the price goes higher than that, I want 2 blocks. And what this guarantees is that if the price were to rise above that, there's demand from other bidders that is greater in value than this, then the auctioneer will say, you value it less than they do, I'll go ahead and remove your demand. If somebody else wants to drop at a higher price, right, they value it more than I do. So the auctioneer will push the posted price up to their bid price, see if dropping them would set supply equal to demand, and say, oh, supply equals demand, that's the price equilibrium, I'll set the price there. And one of the key things to understand about why are we submitting a price point, why am I not just submitting the price, right? Because what the price point does is allow us to express some value in the window, is that it's a standard unitless measure of your valuation of the product across the entire bid space. So just because New York's more expensive, if I wanted to drop a block in New Orleans, I can enter a lower price point, give that higher priority despite the fact that the prices are relatively different. And conversely, I could put New York at a higher priority with a lower price point than New Orleans. So that's why price points are used in this auction. And the interpretation is very straightforward. It's just where you transition to wanting, where you're moving down your demand curve and wanting less quantity demanded. Okay. I want to look at how different drop bids can be processed. So we're going to submit a couple here. We're going to drop 2 blocks in Orlando, Florida lower at 0.9. And again, this just expresses the value at which I want to drop. We're going to submit what's called a contingent drop in the Orlando upper at a price point of 0. There's no excess demand here, right? So what am I telling the auctioneer? How is this different than the hold bid that we discussed? And the interpretation is the same anywhere else. If demand enters this market from another market or from other methods of adding demand, then I will be dropped if the posted price rises at all. Okay, so even though some bidders may think that, oh, I can just put in a hold bid, the posted price isn't going to rise. But we saw in the last round that hold bids are bids that show a value up to the clock price. So what I'm saying is contingent on somebody increasing demand on this market, please drop me down. Okay, and then finally, we're going to drop 1 block in the New Orleans lower at a price point of 0.25. There's 1 unit of excess demand here. It's pretty common to think that there's a guarantee that because I'm dropping 1 unit of demand and there's excess demand of 1, that the posted price of $5,720 will only rise to my $5,863. That's not a guarantee. Even though I am submitting a bid where if the rest of the market does not change position, demand could enter this market, okay? The clock price can still rise, or the posted price can still rise all the way to the clock price. So we can submit this bid and take a look at how the results differ from our simple expectations. Okay, so we can see that New York lower was fully processed, and just as one would expect, the posted price rose to the prior round's clock price. We can see in Orlando lower, we were marked as being partially processed. We requested a drop of 2, only 1 unit was dropped, and the new posted price is our bid price. So we had dropped at a price point of 0.9. Somebody else expressed to the auctioneer that they valued a single block less than we did. So the auctioneer says, I want to keep this block in the hands of the person who values it the most, which was me. They processed the other person's 1 block drop. They then took a look at my drop for 2 blocks and said, well, I can process 1 of them, and then I'll set the price where supply equals demand, which is with you keeping 1 block that you had requested the drop. So I was partially processed, and my bid price set the posted price. The Orlando upper was not processed. No demand entered that market. But if we were bidding, if this was a real bid in a real auction, we would continue to want to express that value round after round, that if this price were to rise, we want to drop a block. And then finally, the New Orleans lower. We were fully processed, but somebody introduced a block of demand into this market. So even though we thought that our bid was going to drop supply equal to demand, it did not. New demand entered, and it was important for us to understand that there was always the possibility that the clock price would rise or the posted price would rise to the clock price. So, just a quick summary, drop bids are not guarantees that posted prices are not going to stop. And we use what's called intra-round bidding, given the price point, to express exactly where we are in our demand curve and where we want to transition from a certain quantity to another quantity, which influences the price when supply equals demand. So the next bid that we're going to cover is the ad bid. And what's important to understand when discussing ad bids is how you're allowed to reorganize your current position. So we said that everything sort of comes back to movements away from our initial position. And the way that the auctioneer tries to get you to bid your true valuations from the start is by enforcing this eligibility constraint. We have submitted some drop bids, so our activity fell below the 95% rule, and our eligibility thusly fell to 261,000 bidding units. So we cannot go back to our initial position bid, right? Which makes perfect sense. Prices have gone up, and so we've reduced position. It wouldn't make sense to say, okay, prices continue to rise, but I now somehow want a larger quantity demanded. The slope of the demand curve there isn't being very truthful. So when we add, we have to stay within this eligibility constraint, which makes perfect economic sense. That means that we have to take demand either from one of 2 places. The first one is from that 5%, the difference between our prior round's processed activity and our current eligibility. That comes from the 95% rule. And that's there just to give bidders some flexibility, around 5% of their current bids flexibility. So I can add 1 block in Orlando, Florida lower, and I don't have to drop demand in any other market, right? I can see my requested activity rises but stays below eligibility. If I wanted to add a second block, so a bid up to 4, I can see my requested activity turned red because now I'm requesting more activity than I have eligibility. And so the auctioneer is telling me, no, that's not valid. They won't accept this bid. And so how then can I express that I want 4 blocks in Orlando now? Well, I have to take those bidding units from another market, right? I can reduce my demand in New Orleans lower by 1, freeing up the bidding units associated with that block. And if that drop is processed, those bidding units will be freed up and they will move into Orlando. But there's no guarantee that they will be processed. Somebody else can also bid for the drop in the excess demand at 0, and the auctioneer may process their bid first, in which case only 1 block of mine will be processed. So I'm requesting a 2-block increase, but I'm only certain that 1 of them will be processed. The other one is contingent on the rest of the market and how the auctioneer processes my request to drop. So we can stage this bid, have the auctioneer run it through, and then import results. Okay, so now we can see that our bid actually was fully processed. We were the person who set supply equal to demand, or that was set supply equal to demand in New Orleans. Our drop was processed. And those bidding units were freed up. So when the auctioneer came back or came to the ad bid, either the first time or maybe the second time when they restarted the bid queue and considered the processing again, they saw that we had freed up some bidding units from New Orleans and used those bidding units to add that second block in Orlando. So the idea behind ad bids is that you have to understand where your eligibility is being moved around from and how it's processed and considered by the auctioneer. Okay, the final type of bid that we're going to cover is the switch bid. And a switch bid is a request to move demand from one product in a market to another product within a market. So we can look at this by submitting a switch bid in the Orlando lower to the Orlando upper at a price point of 0. So what is a switch bid and why is it an option in the auction? Well, first of all, the products have to be considered largely substitutes. So these are products that the auctioneer understands the bidder may see as very substitutable. They're within the same geographic region. Okay, but why not just a drop bid and an ad bid? And the answer to that question is you don't have to concern yourself with, like with ad bids and drop bids, about where that demand is or those bidding units are coming from. So the switch bid guarantees that the bidding units used to make the ad come from the drop. I don't have to worry about a different market being dropped and those bidding units being used to make this ad. And I also do not have to think about the bidding units coming out of my free eligibility given the activity rule. So they're entirely contingent on the drop being made, and that ad will only use bidding units that come from the dropped market. So we can go ahead and submit this bid and then take a look. And we fully know that the bidding units will come out of the Orlando lower if the ad is made in the upper. And we can see that we were fully processed. All right. So those are the types of bids that are very fundamental and used commonly across these styles of auctions. And I hope that we've covered at least some of the economic intuition about the values that you were expressing to the auctioneer and how the auctioneer considers those values when trying to process the requests of all bidders. The final thing that we're just going to cover is the closing conditions of an auction, and that is when supply is less than and equal to demand for all products. Supply doesn't have to be equal to demand, it just has to be less than or equal to demand. So we don't have to worry about Walla Walla, Washington not being fully subscribed. The rest of the market is going to reduce demand sufficiently that this auction will close. And the auction validation system notices this and tells us that the clock rounds are closed. Okay, so at this point, our current position is our final position, and we can see our process commitment. That is the final financial exposure that we had faced in this auction. So this covers all the basics that we wanted to go over. At this point, we wanted to use the rest of the time for myself and the rest of the auction team here at Economists Incorporated to answer any questions or maybe discuss points that they wanted to add while I was giving this overview.
I think we should take questions if there are any. Thanks, Chris. That was, the purpose was to give bidders who are individuals who have followed these auctions, perhaps someone on the legal team who may work in the consultation phase or the rulemaking phase of the auction, but never actually got to sit in a war room and see what it's like to bid in the auction, or a new bidder that's interested in potentially participating, a chance to see what it's like. And so hopefully folks got something out of that, if there's anyone listening.
Yeah.
At bare minimum, Chris, you had 4 people on the absolute edges of our seats. we had the whole seat, but we were only using the edge.
Yeah.
Yeah, we all of us with auction backgrounds, we come to these conferences and learn so much engineering and technology that goes into building out, LTE, 5G, all the policy challenges. So we just wanted to give everyone a taste of what the auctions are actually like.
Yeah. I mean, hopefully the way that we frame this economically in the context of expressing values and how the auctioneer tries to take those and assign products to the people that value the most. So at least we'll give you some water cooler talking points about the Nobel Prize that was awarded recently. Which is something that was pretty exciting for all of us who work on this end of the auction work. Yeah, so if no one has any questions or, about any specific points that we covered, or maybe something that I didn't go into in depth just because we're not trying to cover every single corner case of this. We're definitely available to answer questions in the chat on the event platform after the showcase. Feel free to reach out. We're happy to discuss anything. There were certainly things that I didn't go into in depth, that's for sure.
And this was also meant to be really about the auction rules. We really focused on the rules and in the context of an FCC-style auction. So lower and upper, switch bids, requests, these are all in the FCC's language. But this type of auction is common, across the world. It's been adopted by more and more countries. So if there's anything we can answer about how it might be slightly different in other countries, happy to.
Right. Yeah, we also focus primarily on the elements that we think don't vary as much across countries, because there certainly are components that consistently vary across regulators.
Alan, you want to take this one?
Is there a question?
Yeah, so someone's asking about the differences between an SMRA and this style clock auction.
That's funny. I can't see the
Just
specific question.
Look on the private chat. Jordan posted it.
Oh, okay. Okay, so this is yeah, I can take that, and then Shreyas, you or anyone can fill in. So the first thing you have to consider when looking at the SMRA is it a frequency specific generic, a frequency specific or a generic SMRA? So the old style SMRA, for which Paul won the Nobel Prize in large part for his work in designing it, that was implemented first back in the early 90s, had specific frequency blocks for each product. So in New York, you would have product A, B in that initial PCS auction back in '94. In LA, you would have A and B, and those were specific frequency designations. And in this uniform price clock auction, because now there's a desire for aggregating blocks into contiguous spectrum and to move the auction along much more quickly, you have generic spectrum blocks in a first stage of the allocation, and then a separate assignment stage where you figure out which contiguous blocks you will win. So the original SMRA was developed during the PCS time period, when you were only interested typically in winning one block in any geographic region. And then as wireless evolved, and as you required demand for more and more blocks within any geographic region, the auction design needed to evolve. And because there was a desire for contiguous spectrum, you have the allocation phase with generic spectrum and separate assignment. And that's why what the FCC is doing now is so nice, is that you can move things along much more quickly, and you can reduce the exposure risk of winning a block, a number of blocks that aren't contiguous, and then having unwanted spectrum or inefficient spectrum after the auction. The final thing that deserves mention is that you can conduct an SMRA with generic spectrum. Spain has done it, the UK did it in 2018. It's very similar to what the FCC is doing now, except it's much slower. What's really nice about what the FCC does is that it's only you have one price window that's in effect in one round, and all bidders meet that price window or reject it in the same round. In an SMRA, it takes multiple rounds for all bidders to meet the prices in that window or at that price, asking price. And so the auction just takes much longer, which is why we like the FCC-style auction, simply because it's quicker. And although many of the places we go to visit for these auctions are nice, sitting in a war room for a month is much better than sitting in a war room for 4 months.
Alan, I think you touched on something that I didn't go into during the presentation when you're talking about the contiguous spectrum, which is one of the things that the US faces that is a bit unique is the large geographic size. The product space is incredibly large. So managing continuous spectrum across all of those markets when you're doing something like an SMRA versus this clock auction, it's such a large task compared to the example we were showing you with only a handful of markets.
Exactly. I mean, imagine what Verizon would have had to do in auction 103, where it was winning 10 blocks in one region. If it had to do that in an SMRA, it would have been a disaster.
Yep. And this might be a good segue to the next question. Someone asked, what are your thoughts on auction process for smaller market areas and Cbrs versus PEA size? We're not going to take any opinions on that, but it's a really interesting question, this question of geographic areas and how granular they are. Most countries don't do what the US and Canada do, which is have reasonably small areas. A lot of countries do nationwide blocks. In the US, the PEA has become increasingly common. I think the first time it was used was the incentive auction. It's been used for most auctions since then. The question of whether to use smaller market areas, it really depends on what entrants you expect in the auction and if those entrants would be interested in the smaller areas but not in the larger areas. The risk you face, though, as Alan was talking about with the Verizon example, is that it's much tougher for the larger players who want to get large swaths of spectrum, contiguous, same number of blocks across many areas. It becomes tougher for them to get to that efficient outcome if you have really tiny geographic areas.
Yeah, that's really well characterized. The trade-off between allowing smaller bidders to express their values clearly versus the time trade-off, especially for larger bidders, and maintaining their demand across all those areas.
Yeah, just before another question, I think it's worth to add, when considering the PEA, you need to reflect on the FCC's decision-making at that time. So the PEA was rolled out after the AWS-3 auction and before the broadcast incentive auction. And no matter what decision the FCC makes, it is going to make someone upset, or maybe everyone upset. And so what the FCC did is it balanced the EA, where there was 176 across the US, with the CMA, where there was 734. And it basically said, we're going to split the baby, and because bigger bidders like the EAs or the REAGs and smaller bidders like the CMAs, pretty much everyone has gotten used to it. And I don't think it overly offends any one party too much. So I assume that the FCC will probably use the PEA going forward, unless there's a specific auction like the Cbrs auction or like the forthcoming 2.6 gigahertz auction that obviously requires something different because of the way it's banded.
Yeah.
And we saw that happen with the 28 gigahertz auction too. That it was just leftover counties really, so
Yeah,
you kind of had to do it.
Yeah, auction 101 it's so for residual, and auction 101 was a frequency specific SMRA,
Right.
which you know, the FCC was, that's what made sense. So now, you know, when you look at what the commission is doing, it has these 3 decades of experience in conducting auctions, and it has a very wide toolkit of processes that can use, and it's considering all of them. And I think it's doing a rather good job in that respect.
All right.
Okay.
So
I just want to thank everyone for joining us. I hope that the presentation was helpful, and just want to reiterate that if anyone has any questions they want to ask in the post-auction format, just let us know.
Yeah, thanks so much everyone for tuning in. And thank you, Jordan, Kate, Dan, Forum Global people for setting this up. It's been great.
all right, shall we sign off?